So is Next.js planning to support RSS out of the box?
That's a great question. So one of the things that we've sort of not supported that well yet is the idea of generating things other than HTML pages. So for example, a lot of people want to take this idea of, well, I want to pre-render certain things at build time, and they pre-render their pages, for example. But what about the open graph images? So the images that go on Twitter. Almost everybody that I know is delegating those to runtime, or they don't support them at all. So basically, Next.js should give you the ability to say, well, I also want to pre-render images at build time. And then I want to do some just in time at runtime. Kind of this idea of like deciding when you do this rendering process, whether at build time, whether at runtime. So that applies also very nicely to other formats, not just images, but sitemaps and RSS feeds. So you should have the ability to use these techniques. Right now, there's some hacks that you could use. So for example, you could define a function to generate your RSS feed. And then you could do a rewrite. So you can say, for example, /RSS should go to /API/RSS. And then you generate it with a Next.js API function, and then you send a cache control header so that you make sure it's cached. So that'd be a great way of supporting RSS. But it feels like to me that there should be a more natural Next.js way of saying, this is not a regular page, but this is another type of format that I want to generate, and use the same capabilities of static generation, just-in-time generation, server rendering, etc. So great question.
So there's another question for you on the chat from Dominique. Yes. Sorry if I totally mispronounced that. But if you have advantages of Next over Nuxt, they would like to hear about them.
I haven't used Nuxt that much yet. I'm really excited about Nuxt 3, and that's when I'm actually going to start using it for my own projects. These days, I only hack during the weekends, but I love to try new technologies. And I also always want to make sure that Vercel has the best possible experience for all frameworks. So I want to use Nuxt 3, and I'll have right off the bat, I know that Nuxt has a lot of exciting things we don't have. Like Nuxt content is amazing. So I think at this point, it probably comes down to what does your project put more emphasis on?
Mm-hmm.
And first of all, I think Vue and React have very non-overlapping communities today. So obviously the choice is simple. If you like the Next style of doing things, to use Next. If you like React, use Nuxt. If you like Vue. But for teams that are flexible or on the fence, I think it comes down to like, okay, what features are absolutely critical for this project? So for example, Nuxt 3 is gaining capabilities for functions. Next.js already has it. On the other hand, if you want better integration with Git-based content, Nuxt content is amazing, and Next.js doesn't have something like that. So and both frameworks always have ways of filling in the gaps. So the differences in terms of feature functionality in the short term, don't matter that much, because, for example, on Vercel, you can add API functions to a Next project with no problems. And similarly, on a Next project, you can add any CMS that you want without needing a official Next content layer. So it ends up being, what are things that resonate more to you, to your project, to your team, and then go with that.
Right. Very nice. Okay, so we have a couple of new questions coming in. We do have some. Okay, so I love the idea of pick and choose APIs to build backend, but when I need a monolithic backend, like Nest, heart emoji, because of price or whatever.
We hear that a lot. We hear amazing things about Nest. Yeah. And maybe, by the way, there is something to be said about projects that start with an N and then have 3 letters. So that's very valid. Nest is a very comprehensive backend solution, whereas Next.js and Nuxt will be more lightweight on what they expose in terms of API support and functions. So I would say the idea of having a monorepo where your front end is, for example, Next or Nuxt, and then your back end, and there are two separate sort of folders in the monorepo, and one is Nest and one is your front end layer. That's an amazing way of working nowadays, where you have front end specialists in your team, you have back end specialists in your team. I do see a world where there's better and better integration between these tools, right? So I could see a world where your deploy previews on Vercel also help trigger integrations for your backend. Like there could be an integration between Vercel and Laravel Vapor if you use Laravel Vapor for your backend and Vercel for your front end. So things will continue to get better, as well as like Next will over time gain better features for the API directory. But in the short term, in the medium term, I think using Nest as for your backend, using Next for your front end or Nuxt is great. And I think when you need that kind of power, it does make sense to go to a more specialized tool like Nest with an S.
So I guess, yeah, their question also, they want to know if Vercel is the right place to host this.
Yeah, to host Nest itself, no. To build glue between your front and the Nest, yes. So for example, even for how we build our own website and how we build Nextjs.org, for example, or Vercel.com, we have a lot of API functions that are not part of our proper backend. So our proper backend is managed by our amazing infrastructure and backend team. It sort of gets released independently, etc. It's versioned, it has a change log. And then the front end is, like almost like a separate client. And it's written in Next.js, obviously. But we do have functions on the Next.js, in the Next.js repo that allow front-end developers to add functionality and move fast without having to necessarily go and like modify a more heavier backend. So as an example that I like to give is, or even the question before, where if we need to generate RSS with a dynamic quote unquote backend function, that's not something that you might go and like, edit your proper backend, like add something like that, because it might not even fit. In this case, this API belongs more in the front end realm. So Next.js can give you sort of the glue between systems like that. So also with regards to the question about identity, that's a great question, right? Like if you need to use a backend that's off the shelf, like Stripe, like Twilio, like SendGrid, like Magic, in a lot of cases, you can't go to those systems directly from the client. You need to go through a protected sandbox or an authorization layer on the backend. And that's where Next.js API functions are amazing, because you can just go and like query your function, define it really easily inside your project, and then that function can talk to the more comprehensive backends.
We do have a question that I'm assuming means, are there new features coming into for Vercel functions?
So we think that the whole developer experience belongs in the framework layer. So I love working with teams like Nextjs because they're adding all of these amazing features directly into the framework. So as an example, you might have some preferences for TypeScript and Babel and so on that you define for your front end framework. And then if you're using sort of an API folder that comes from a different system, the system starts to like not cooperate nicely, and there starts like some rough edges start happening on the developer experience, on the sort of code syntax support, on the type checking system, and so on. So we're really excited about frameworks owning the entire layer of application development experience. And then the platform sort of becomes this sort of transparent layer. So I just import my project, my next project into Vercel, and boom, it just works perfectly. I don't have to learn any new features that are outside my framework. Mm-hmm. That I think is the ultimate way that we should go. We're starting to see the emergence of frameworks that are embracing this idea. So obviously Nuxt is an early mover, but then there is Redwood and other frameworks that are saying, look, we'll give you all these capabilities that you need directly in the framework layer, if you want to have a great developer experience, you're just going to run, framework dev commands. You don't even need to think about what your hosting provider does. And then you just push your code. And then that's when the platform kicks in. That's when like the CI/CD pipeline kicks in, which can be super optimized. Then that's when like the edge optimizations kick in. So all that awesomeness is, I think, the responsibility of Vercel. But we embrace the community, just sort of, doing awesome things on the framework layer.
Very nice. So we have a question about, I'll just read it. So differential scripts loading is a must for e-commerce sites and still having to support IE 11. So will this feature be integrated into Next?
Yeah, so we're thinking a lot about these problems nowadays because we hear the same things, right? Like e-commerce needs a lot of personalization, for example. They need a lot of differential script serving, even on a per user basis. If I'm Guillermo and I go to staples.com, which I don't go to because I don't buy office supplies, but if I went, which is an Next.js website, and for example, I'm in San Francisco, there might be a certain widget or personalized shopping experience that applies to me and my neighbors. So that script should only be served to that specific user. Next.js today has a basic form of support of this, which is called Next/Dynamic. But we're looking forward to making this a more automatic primitive, where depending on the data layer, you're basically loading code that applies to cohorts of users, and then all the smart bundling happens as a side effect, or as transparently to you. You don't have to think of like, oh, I need to bundle this for I11, I need to bundle this for this user. That even applies to language, right? So imagine that my sign up button component already comes with the right inline label for the right language that the user is in. Or imagine that the right to left CSS style sheet also, due to the natural branching of data, like let's say if the user is coming from Saudi Arabia and they are on a browser whose accept language header is Arabic, and then we need to render right to left, let's make it natural that if the developer is writing all this branching and they're importing a right to left CSS style sheet, only that cohort of users will get it. So that today takes a lot of work. And this is kind of what I'm like, if I had to say, like, what am I most excited about in Next.js's future is this kind of capability.
Right.
Because it's tough to do this on the web today. And yeah, and I think for IE11, for example, like today we have also basic support for polyfilling automatically for older browsers and things like that. But this also applies for features like, say, if older than IE11, redirect all users to this page that says we don't support it. I also want to have that because we get a lot of Sentry exceptions that say the user is on Samsung phone from 5 years ago, and we really don't have the bandwidth as a company or interest to support that browser. So having rewrite and redirect level features that allow you to differentially treat browsers and even redirect into a static page, I'm excited about that too, because I don't like exceptions.
Very nice. So I guess that really does help, like with accessibility stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So screen readers, for example, you can create a personalized experience for them. And sometimes there's been a dichotomy of, well, I want to add a lot of features. Maybe I don't have accessibility experts on the team full time because we're a small company, or altogether the experience just doesn't make sense for screen readers. So that idea of differentially creating experiences will certainly move the needle, I think, for accessibility. We'll make it even more approachable for developers to even be aware. It's almost like adding built-in support for accessibility in Next in a way that the developers are still in control, rather than try to like do some automatic, degraded experience. So you can actually create an experience for those cohorts of users.
I am all for this. I love it.
Awesome.
So let's see. So is somebody okay? So let's see. Is something like Netlify's edge handler to work directly on in a specific edge?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the way that I explain computation nowadays is I call it everywhere computing. So I think a lot of the fallacies in our industry have been that, oh, the future is computation in this one specific place. So what I covered in the talk, which I said like single page applications, those are great, but you're saying, okay, computation will only happen on the client side. Then you face reality and start realizing, well, I need to do some server computation here. I need to do some other build time computation here. And the way that I model it is that there's going to be computation that happens at the origin. And what do I mean by origin is, for example, where your database is. So, for example, if you have a GraphQL server, you want the GraphQL server to be right next to your database. And let's call that the origin computation layer. Then when the user visits a page, there might be some computation that you actually want to do at the edge directly, right? So computation happening at the edge, computation happening at origin. And then you have computation that is happening on the client side as well, because like everything cool with like offline PWA, animation, interaction, rapid feedback, caching on the web browser, all that is computation happening on the device. So the paradigm of Next.js is embracing that computation will happen everywhere. It happened at build time, it happened at origin, it happened at the edge, it happened on the client side. So there's a lot of computation everywhere. Obviously in the service of the best possible user experiences. So yes, I think the way that this would be the most tasteful to execute on, as I said earlier, would be on the framework level, rather than having to learn a new way of doing it for a specific platform. And I think still there's a lot to do with optimizing other places right now. Like you can do some fun stuff at the edge, but that's not really where the data lives. So you only get marginal advantages. But yes, I think competition will definitely happen there. We're seeing it with Fastly, we're seeing it with Cloudflare workers. There's lots of interesting use cases. In a lot of cases, it makes a lot of sense to combine the technologies. Like we see a lot of people using a edge layer like Akamai, and then they put Vercel behind it. Especially enterprise customers already have existing edge infrastructure that they're happy with. So combining these technologies is a great option as well.
That's actually kind of tying into the next question, whether this would work with other frameworks like Nuxt, and will it be able to leverage this feature?
Exactly. I think, like I said, I'm always a big believer on like the best possible developer experience, and it is everything starts there for me. So the most natural way that you would think about edge computation would be that Nuxt one day says, well, you can define this new middleware layer that is more constrained. And I think as an industry, we haven't really determined exactly what the constraints are yet. So that's what's tricky about edge computation is that, so Fastly, for example, says, we'll initialize a WASM module per request in 25 microseconds. And that WebAssembly sandbox will have, a certain amount of memory available to it and a certain amount of runtime. Cloudflare workers will say, well, you can only use V8 and we'll automatically upgrade it for you. And then we added this sort of API layer on top that is just for Cloudflare workers, like for example, their HTML rewriting primitive. So I think what's yet to be seen is how much the framework can offer that doesn't even require writing code. So for example, if you look at our internationalization support RFC for Next.js, we could have given you a full edge function to do internationalization redirects. But what we found is that everyone kind of expects internationalization to work almost in the same way. So it's almost like the static version of an edge handler, right? Because you're saying, hey, Next, I just want internationalization support. And you didn't even have to write the edge handler. So the edge handler just gets, think of it as like generated from your configuration where you say, I want to support these 5 languages. Now, obviously, I think some people in the audience would counter argue that, well, but what if I have this edge case? And yes, I think more freedom in the edge computation layer would definitely help there.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. This one's a little bit more specific. So I need to think how server-side render or prerender Vue or Laravel quite big website. But Vue inline templates and Laravel includes are so slow, and I want to refactor everything on Nuxt or Next. How much time do you think that this will take since you may React to be server rendered?
I think obviously, I mean, the bad answer that everyone would give you is it depends.
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you that I've seen a lot of people be successful in modernizing front end when they can do it a page at a time. So this is why I'm in love with the Next and Next model of pages, because you create your project and say, okay, I'm going to modernize my first page, and it has declarative file system routing, and it's called, you know, dashboard.js or dashboard.vue. So one feature that we recently added to Next is that we have this rewrites support. So what you can say is, hey, Next.js, handle all the pages that you have that are declared in Next, and if not, fall back to my existing system. So, and then you send your traffic to Next first, and Next will send the traffic to Laravel if it doesn't have it. So I like that model a lot, because then the question doesn't become, how long does it take to refactor the entire app? The question gets broken down into, how long does it take me to make my first successful one page and feel good about the result and show that it'll be faster, show it to my teammates, show it to my clients and so on. And then it's not maybe it'll take a year. Doesn't matter, because you're making progress, and you're making fast progress one page at a time.
Right. Well, Guillermo, thank you so much for your time.